Okay, can everybody try to think of one thing, this is going to be a hard one thing that has to do with colonial education in the South, in the Middle, and in New England? What about the South? Everybody think of something about the South. Just doesn't have to be deep or even significant, just something that we talked about. Should have something there easily. Who hasn't got anything? You were not here. You're excused. All right, tell your neighbor something about the South and the effect of, or something about the South that affected education. All right. You should have heard something like agricultural, aristocratic, plantations, private, long distance between people, not a lot of density of people in one place. Okay? All right, what about the middle? Everybody think of something about the middle colonies, and something either about the education or something that obviously affected the progress or the development of education in the middle colonies. Rebecca will have the most answers here since Pennsylvania is one of the middle colonies. I'm just adding a little humor at your expense. Okay, you should have something. At least to me, it's very simple. Of course, I've taught this about 15 times, so it's easier. All right, who doesn't have anything about the middle? See, almost everybody has something. Okay, let's tell our neighbor something about middle colonies and education. See, Haley likes this. She gets to talk to her neighbor. Okay, so you should have had something like diversity, variety, because there's a variety of religions and languages, cultures. You might have had, it was slow, it didn't develop so much as others because of that diversity. You might have mentioned Christopher Dock. Did anybody mention Christopher Dock? Wow. Well, all right, Christopher Dock. What's important about Christopher Dock, or why do we mention his name? He's Dutch? I can't remember what he was. He might have been Dutch, he might have been Deutsch. German. So why do we mention him in the history of education? We have a few hands that are volunteering. There's another one that finally found it in his notes. Nicole.
He was the first person to write a book on educational practices in the colonies.
Right. First educational book written and published in the colonies. Written in the colonies. Maybe it wasn't published in the colonies, but I don't remember that. And it was called School Management on Practices of Education. All right, now we have lots to choose from in New England. Think of something. Everybody think of something about education in New England. Anything that was probably the whole second half of our class period or more. And that's kind of a hint towards something you could say about it. All right, anybody not have anything about New England? Okay, all right, tell your neighbor something about New England's education. Somehow we got to get Sarah to understand what the lecture was about. Okay. Let me hear what some of you heard for this one. Let me hear what some of you heard. See, so you don't have to say what you said because I might make fun of it. You can say what somebody else said and I'll make fun of them. All right. No. What did you hear, Meadow?
The Old Deluder Satan Act.
The Old Deluder Satan Act. Very, very important. In fact, that's going to be on the test. And you might not be able to look at your notes when you take the next test. I'll yet to decide that. But the Old Deluder Satan Act, we should remember the date for the Old Deluder Satan Act. Is it on the board still? No? Okay. So let's go ahead and I'll erase this. What's the date of the Old Deluder Satan Act? 1647. Not 18. A lot of people would choose 18 on past tests for some reason. I don't know why. 16. Well before our Declaration of Independence. 1647. Okay? So the date is important if we're in 4th grade. And it is important. What was it about? What's important about the Old Deluder Satan Act? Because, as I said, everybody, at least in what I've read and seen, everybody goes back and says, 1647. If they're talking about American education, they go back to 1647 as the old Deluder Satan Act, and some mock that they called it the old Deluder Satan Act because that archaic thinking about the devil and things like that. But what are the important parts of it? Why is it such a referred to document in our history? Tell us one thing, Jonathan.
We want to make sure everybody was educated so that they could read the Bible and actually know what they believe.
Okay, so education's purpose was so that they could read the Bible and know what they believe. Okay, he also said something else, but I highlighted the one part. What's another reason that it's looked at as such an important document?
It was it basically provided for public schools.
It provided that education be public, or be available to the public. Everybody should have access to education. Okay? Those are probably the two important things from it. So, public education proponents will go and say, and they're honest, it's truthful, that ever since 1647, there have been laws in America that provide for access to education to everyone. Public access to education. So, all right. So we are then kind of right, we're going to hit a point and all of a sudden everybody's going to know that it's not the colonies and we're the United States of America, July 4th, 1776. But of course, education, what happens day-to-day life, didn't change just right on that date. Things are developing. But we're going to enter what I'm calling this, a period called Developing an American School System. That's the title that I give to 1776 to 1860. Developing an American School System. We probably should go ahead and put that through 1865. Let's change that to through 1865. Developing an American School System. Now that's almost 100 years. Now the time period before that was even longer, but there's a tremendous amount that's going to happen in these 90 years of education. Tremendous amount. It's a tremendous number of developments in what happens in American education here. Let's begin by just pointing out some of the founding fathers. And these would be people more involved or influential toward the beginning of this time. One, Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin. He lived from 1706 to 1790. He started an academy in Philadelphia. His academy is still open to this day. It has another name. How many Pennsylvanians do we have here? Rebecca, are you the lone Pennsylvanian? Oh, there's another one. Dave? Any others? Only two? Okay. Well, somebody was merciful to us. Only giving us two Pennsylvanians. In the old days in college, we had a lot of people from Pennsylvania, and they were always talking about how Pennsylvania is God's country and how flat it is out here and all that kind of thing. How miserable it is in Indiana. So, it is flat. I'll agree. So, I can agree with that part, but I won't agree with it being misery. Anyway, Benjamin Franklin's Academy still in existence today as Penn State University. Penn State University. I don't have much to say about it, but we should just recognize that Franklin, along with basically every other of our influential founding fathers, believed in the importance of education. So, another one, Thomas Jefferson. Quite a bit younger than Benjamin Franklin. He lived from 1743 to 1826. At some point, he tried to get the Virginia legislature to establish a compulsory state education system. He tried to get the Virginia legislature to establish a compulsory state education system. He also had a lifelong dream that was finally fulfilled in the founding of the University of Virginia. University of Virginia, one of the rare early American universities that was not started to train people for the ministry. May have been the first. I don't remember exactly. In fact, I don't know the timing on this. Of course, Harvard started in 1635 and Yale 1701. Then we have them starting more quickly after this. But of almost all of the first 126 colleges it started, and that would be probably up to about 1800 or before, were Christian. Their primary purpose was to train people for the ministry. Yeah, you're missing something?
No.
Okay.
I believe that there's a university named after him still.
Who?
Jefferson.
Oh, there could be. Yes, there could be. But the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, I don't know what their mascot is or anything like that, but still in existence, is that was his dream, and he was able to see that started. Interestingly, to me at least, I just read a book about John Broadus. Any guys recognize the name John Broadus? B-R-O-A-D-U-S? Or ladies? Bookstore? You recognize? John Broadus wrote probably the defining book on the preparation. The title is On the Preparation and Delivery of Sermons. So it's a homiletics textbook. He wrote it in 1878, something like that. Anyway, he was educated at the University of Virginia. This is just all extra stuff to try to keep your attention between when you have to write notes down. He was educated at the University of Virginia, and one of his most influential teachers at the University of Virginia was William H. McGuffey. So McGuffey taught there. We're going to mention him later in this section. So, of eclectic reader fame, that everybody's like, oh, I've heard of McGuffey. So, anyway, University of Virginia, one of the first, what we would call secular universities, not started. Now, for that matter, Broadus becomes a very influential leader in church history in the Southern Baptist Convention, actually. He learns Greek, Hebrew, many languages at the University of Virginia. He does learn, at that point in time, there really wasn't very many I mean, okay, so it's interesting that I'm saying this. They were started for religious purposes, but most of them by the later 18 or mid 1800s had become. There wasn't like you could learn religion there, but there wasn't many seminaries where you could learn to be a pastor. You just kind of would learn by experience or by extra study, more like an apprenticeship type of a thing in America. Anyway. Where was I going with that? So you could, while it was a secular university, a lot of very religious education is still taking place there. It's just not that it was not started for that purpose. Not that it didn't include it. It just wasn't started for that purpose. Okay, I don't have with me. I have it. Benjamin Rush, very influential educator, Dr. Benjamin Rush, who was a medical doctor. And one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, lived from 1746 to 1813. And then this is kind of later, but I'm going to leave him as a founding father, Noah Webster. Lived from 1783 to 1843. 1783 to 1843. He was very intent on what I would say is developing an American identity. Of course, he was born after the Declaration of Independence, actually born in about the year that the fighting of our war for independence stopped. So by the time he's 17, we're electing our third president. Okay, and he's probably at 17, he's a teacher or something like that already. Don't have his complete history, but I'm just trying to put you in a frame of mind. We're still very British, even though we've got our independence in the 1800s. We are still very British. There's a strong contingent of people actually that wouldn't mind if we just said, okay, now that we've proven that you can't treat us the way you were, why don't we still be part of the realm? Why don't we still be part of the kingdom? Just treat us right. There's a fair amount of people that are still sympathetic toward British things, and this is and Webster's thinking all through his life is that we're independent. We're Americans. We do things differently here. We do have the English language. He's especially influential in that with the language. Writes the Blueback Speller, which is like the second highest seller of all time up to a certain point. Just behind the Bible. It's probably the first first item that's not the Bible that's published for use in education. Anyway, he believes in developing an American identity. That's why he has an American dictionary of the English language. There are certain things that we did differently in America than they did there. Okay? How many know what this word is? Only our historians. Or what is it, Serenity?
Jail.
Jail. Yeah, in America we spell it like that. Okay? I know you know this, right? Okay? Okay, that's English. Americans take the U out, and neighbor, and labor, and color, and all of those. Just the U is an English thing, without the U is an American thing. As a side note, this is not the satanic spelling of that word. Some people are in such beloved, they love the King James Version so much that they think that if you take the U out, you're the Antichrist. So, anyway, so he taught a biblical work ethic, support his, all of his Blueback Speller is teaching, you're learning the letters of the alphabet and you're learning verses of Scripture that go along with it and principles and all that type of thing. Biblical principles in that, in his in that blueback speller. Barrick.
Can you still get that?
The blueback speller? I'm sure you can. Yeah. As I was thinking, I thought, if we were taking the whole semester on it, I would go find one and bring it. Maybe I should go find one and bring it anyway for next year. Sorry. Yes.
How much, like, of what he had in there do we use nowadays, if at all?
Oh, probably a tremendous amount. Not directly, but your old-fashioned educators are going to. There's going to be phonics in there. Christian educators are going to. I mean, maybe not the same ones, but when you were in kindergarten, you remember learning the A verse, the B verse, the C verse. Okay, that's stuff that he did. He's using Bible examples, maybe not exclusively, but all over the place in the teaching of educational, of things that you need to know when you're in school. Okay, and as I said, his blueback speller sells hundreds of thousands of copies, and this is in the time of the early America. I can't remember. I was just in conversation with somebody else who would know this a lot better, but the number was staggering. I want to say something like 300,000 copies. Has like 56 printings, before he died or something like that. What does that tell you? If they're being printed and there's that many copies, they're not being kept in a storage bin. They're being used. Okay, right now we have 330 million people in America. We're talking about 200 years ago. How many people were in America at that point? So basically, I think it's fair to say, as a general statement, everybody in America is being trained, taught with his materials. I'm sure somebody over here, somebody over there, maybe just couldn't afford it or whatever, and didn't use it. But basically, everybody's being taught with the Bible and the blueback speller, which is using Bible examples for all kinds of things. It's not just the speller. So I'm trying to paint a picture here that a lot of people are being educated. We'll get to the amount of them sometime here. And they're being educated in a Christian way. Okay? Not Baptist, because some people are not Baptists, but they're being educated in a Christian way. They're being taught with the Bible and then with other things that are based upon or that are using the Bible to help teach these things. Coming into this time period of 1776, we're just like coming into this time, we begin to see boarding schools started. This is a further development. Before this time, in 1647, we say they've got to be like what we would call primary education, and then if there's a town of 100 or more, then they have to have Latin. They have to have grammar school education, which is a Latin grammar school, which is going to prepare them for college. Now there's the development of a boarding school. If you're wondering in your notes don't need to look like mine, but I've gone into, number 1 was founding fathers, number 2 is educational developments. Okay, so now I'm not going to be talking as much about people as things that happened through this time period. And one of those developments, you might put the idea of things beside the Bible being used in education, is a development that begins right before this time period. By the 1750s, there's other materials beside the Bible used to help aid learning. So, and then you have these boarding schools. Boarding schools are started. A Latin grammar school was in a town, but then you'd have a boarding school for various reasons. And of course, back then, people were not as averse to leaving home or sending their kids off to school as they are these days. And I don't know why that happens. Maybe we have so much education close by, we don't need to send them away. But So there'd be a boarding school. In the north, most of these boarding schools were like college preparatory schools. In the south, they were more like a trade school for the well-to-do. I'm not saying that all they learned, that all they had was wood shop, but its focus was a little different. I think if you were in the south, you would go off to the boarding school and it would be generally what we would think of as a terminal degree. Like you'd go there and be well educated, but be ready to step into a position of what you might call leadership or something like that on the plantation or something like that. In the north, you're going off to the boarding school, and when you finish that, you're going to be ready to go to Yale, Princeton, Harvard, whatever, something like that. Of course, there's private schools. It seems clear that there have been private schools all the way along. Private schools are in contrast to public schools. And why do I say it seems clear that there have been private schools all the way along? At least in my thinking. Can you get inside my thinking? Let me just say, if we have a law that says you must make education available to those that want it, what is that assuming? There's some people that can't get it. What is that assuming? There's other people that are getting it. And where are they getting it? Private education, private schools. Okay, so there's private schools. The law comes along in 1647, way back, says you must make available education to everyone in your town if you have 50 households, and a grammar school if you have 100 households. So there's private education taking place already. And then there's laws that are to provide education to the public. This is going, and then as we get more people here, we have more people in towns, right? And we have more bigger towns. I don't mean like more bigger, just we have more towns that are bigger. And so if we have more bigger towns, we have more grammar schools, right? Okay? So there's more and more schooling. All right, now, not 18, we're not in the 1800s yet. 1787. 1787, the land ordinances of 1787. Land ordinance of 1787. So in 1787, we have a body, we have a national legislative body, but it's not Congress, because our Constitution comes after this point in time. But these laws, this type of law was carried, it was honored as a law of the United States. Let me just tell a little bit about it and then explain, or do some explanation, then we'll write down some things to think about from it. So what's happening? We are already exploring west. I don't know the names of the people, but I'm pretty sure Daniel Boone is one of them. And we're going into the northwest. To us, it's northwest. To Virginia and New York, it's northwest. To us today, it's Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan. The Northwest Ordinance refers to those, I think 5 or 6 states come out of that area. Okay, so, but as a country, these are not part of our colonies, they're frontier, but our citizens are going there. We're claiming it as American territory, and so we're writing laws that are going to govern what happens in those territories as they become developed and they're under our protection and authority. So in these in this area of the Northwest Territory, Congress establishes townships, or they establish that in townships there would be, how's the right way to say this? A township would be generally 6 miles square, 6 miles east to west and 6 miles north to south. Okay? And each square is called a section. Okay. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so this is a town. Okay, and you have sections. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, 10, 12. What is that? 14, 16, and on. Okay? So in 1785, so there's 2 land ordinances. There's the land ordinance of 74-75, and then which tells us something, and then the significant one to education comes in, is like an addendum or added on in 1787. But so I'm going to read part of the land ordinance of 1785. So it says in there, "There shall be reserved for the United States out of every township the 4 lots being numbered 8, 11, 26, and 29, and out of every fractional part of a township so many lots of the same numbers as shall be found thereon for future sale." Okay, so United States is saying this is United States territory. When you create a township, okay, it's your property, but these 4 lots are the government's property. It's just the way that they set it up. Okay? "There shall be reserved the lot number 16 of every township for the maintenance of public schools within the said township." Okay, so the 16th lot, the 16th square mile, is to be set aside for the maintenance of public education. Now, what does that mean? What does that phrase, public education, mean? Put ourselves in 1787. Everybody should be able to answer this question. Okay? Does it mean government education like we see today? It's not public education like we see today. It's education available to the public. So this lot, and I'm not so good at my geometrical and whatever figures, a square mile. How many acres in a square mile? Anybody know? 640, something like that? I can't remember. But there's a square mile that's set aside, and they're to use that square mile in one way or another to support the maintenance of public education. Typically, in a lot of old-time townships, if you're not in a real congested area, the school is going to be in that square mile. Okay? But this is not saying that it has to be there. It's just saying that that square mile is for the maintenance of it, of education, for the provision and maintenance of it. Also, they say, 1/3 part of all gold, silver, lead, and copper mints to be sold or otherwise disposed of as Congress shall hereafter direct. So they're saying this is American territory. You go there, that's fine. 1/3 of the natural resources generally that's there is the United States. The rest is yours. Basically, you know, there was no federal income tax or anything like this. So this is the way that the federal government at that point gets some income, some money. Seems like. Yes?
This is all the land ordinance of 87?
No, this is 84, 85. Now I'm going to tell you about the land ordinance of 87. They work together because they're about the same area. So this first one, the key thing about the first one is the 16th section. Just that is set aside to education. Too many details? It's just a story. In 87, they add on to that the third article Here's the third article, and listen to it first. You know, there's not so many details if you just listen to the story. Not that I'm a good storyteller, but... So, here's the third article of the 1787 ordinance. Religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. Boom. Okay? So what is it saying? Because in order to have good government and general happiness, you have to have religion, morality, and knowledge. Okay? That's the statement. Religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind. Schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. There's other elements of that third article referring to the Indians and in fact, most of the rest of it has to do with Indians and actually dealing with them as if they are people who have lands and property that can't have it just taken away. That Indians have rights and property just like anyone else who lives. But that first sentence is important. Yes, Barrick. Okay, religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind. Schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. One other thing we might just call a development of this time period is 1789, the Boston Education Act. The Boston Education Act of 1789. This Boston Education Act of 1789 calls for the first system of public schools in an American city. All right, so you live in a city. Cities have already been told that they must provide education. Right? 140 years previous to this, the old Duluth-Satan Act. Well, the city of Boston has a lot more than 100 households in it. Okay? So they need some direction, some structure, some order to their own providing of public education. And so they have this, they make this law. It's a system of public schools in an American city. The definition of public schools is going to change, and it might change today, but we're still, historically, we're still, public just means available to everyone. No one is refused access. All right, during this time period, and now kind of the thinking, we're going to think 1800s, early 1800s. By the time we get to the 1800s, we have a tradition of over 150 years of laws, of governance, of education, and actually, they're pretty good laws. There's pretty good government going on. As Baptists, we know there's some persecution taking place, but generally, they're good laws in America. America, of course, we're Americans saying this, but America seems to be at the height of the influence of Christianity and religion on government, education, and all of that at this point in time. That's why, it's one of the reasons why we look back to those times as being so important, so great in a certain sense. But all men are not Christians. Okay? And So we're living in the 1800s. We have laws that are basically based upon the Bible. We have education. People are very well educated, something like 90% some. Where's my statistic? I don't know where it is. It's in the massive letters here. Anyway, huge number of us are educated, meaning can read. Okay, it's a tremendous goal of our founding fathers that the things that are discussed in Congress be discussed in the local pub tavern. Okay, now in those days, the pub tavern, I'm not saying they didn't drink in the pub tavern, but it's not like the bar today. It was a public gathering place, and a lot of people went there. The common person went there. Okay? So what is being discussed at the place where the common person is? Not the horse races, not the World Series. What is taking place in the legislature is being discussed there. So it's important to all of our founding fathers that every common person have an education and not just be able to read, but be able to read and think and discuss the things that are taking place in their own government, because this is a land of self-government, representative self-government. So we have in the early time of America a very good system of government, and what's growing into being a very good system, if you might call it, of education. It's not a top-down driven system, but it's a fairly good, everyone is receiving a good education in this system. Okay? Hold on to that point.
Maybe this is far-fetched, but I just caught you said pub and public gathering place in the same.
I'm sorry?
I'm sorry.
Oh, pub and public. Mm-hmm. It's a public house. It's the public house. Yeah. I don't know the whole history of that, but a pub is short for public house, where everybody would gather around and talk and drink and eat. But if you go to England, I've eaten in a pub. Okay? It's a restaurant. A lot of people just go there. Sure, they serve things, but they serve alcohol all over the place. Okay? So, yes, pub is short for public house, and it would be a place where a lot of stuff is taking place, is going on. It might even be a place where public announcements are posted. I can't remember that for sure. All right, but the picture I'm trying to show you is that along the east, in the colonies, which are now our original 13 states, we have a good system. Sure, it's, we don't have, research universities and stuff like that like we think of today with the expansion of knowledge and information, but we have a good system. Most of the people are literate and well-informed and much involved in their own education and in the government of their country. We also are expanding to the west. So in the east, we have all this, what we might say, great thinking. And the great thinking has produced for us a good government, a good system of education. Okay. As we go west, that government tells the west what to do. In the east, the people told the government what to do. As we go west, the government tells the west what to do. The west is a child of the government. In the east, the government is a child of the east, or of the people. This is just the way things are going to work. It's not necessarily an evil thing. I mean, if you've got a government, the government has to have control. It's going to say the way things are. And for that matter, that government at the time is made up of the people in the east, right? So it's not like evil. It's not like this should never have happened. There's no other way for our westward expansion to happen. But it is the way it happened. People didn't go west and establish their own governments. They came from an established government and an expanding country into the west. It's also a time, we might say it's a time of the flourishing of the common man. In America, the common man can do anything. In Europe, you've got to be nobility in order to do something. In America, anybody can do anything. A farm boy from Kentucky, Illinois, Indiana can become president of the United States. So it's the era of the common man. Excuse me. And there's a tremendously high literacy rate. I've kind of made this point already. In spite of the lack of compulsory attendance laws. Okay, so Thomas Jefferson wanted to get compulsory attendance laws in the state of Virginia. He didn't get it. Okay, Thomas Jefferson is a forward-thinking, progressive-thinking individual, for his time at least. He didn't get what he wanted because the people were like, we don't have to have compulsory, and we know ourselves the importance of education. You don't have to force us to educate our children. Okay? And in a certain sense, Thomas Jefferson is just saying, education is really important. We ought to just make sure everybody's getting it. Let's give him the benefit of the doubt. It is a long time. He is progressive thinking, and what he thinks turns out to have not the greatest results many times, but we have the benefit of history. Jefferson is more of an Enlightenment thinker, okay, than a Reformation thinker. He is. As a matter of fact, it's very significant to America, whether on purpose or not. He was not around when our Constitution was written. You should know that. He was in France. He had nothing to do with the writing of our Constitution. So when people talk about a separation of church and state, which they get from a letter that he wrote, he wasn't even there to hear all the different arguments about the church and the establishment of religion and the free exercise thereof. So his letter, it's just a letter. He's not a constitutional author. So letters from Madison and those type of people would be much more influential in understanding what the Constitution means than Jefferson. So let's get back to what we were talking about. There's no compulsory education. And everybody's literate. People are much involved in their own government and in their own education. By this time, there's not so much. There's not three different areas. There's more like 2 different areas of America at this point, and they are north and south. All of them are Americans, yes. But there's still a way different way of thinking in the South than there is in the North. In the North, there's tremendous density, tremendous what we might call congestion of people. People are in a lot, there's a lot bigger cities, a lot of people in one place. A lot of people in one place, they're going to pool resources. Some of them are going to build companies and businesses and factories, and industry is coming, the steam engine has come along, and schools are going to develop into, schools are going to grow because a lot of people there's a lot of people in one place, so they're going to send their kids there. In the South, you still have a very rural setting. By this time, we've switched from tobacco to cotton, but still very labor-intensive product. And then the discovery of the cotton gin makes it so you can produce even more cotton. And even though it gets the seeds out, you still need a lot more labor to harvest the product. And we have a fairly rigid class society here. Not a caste system like India, but there's still, the plantation owners, the aristocracy, and then maybe in cities there's going to be more what we would call down-to-earth, middle-class type people, and then a lot of slaves. This is the South. In the North, you have industrialism, and we should point out, we mentioned it with Harvard. I think we mentioned it with Harvard, maybe not. But in the North, we also have Unitarianism coming in. Now, I don't think the Unitarianism of that day is like we have today, where Unitarians, if you go to Unitarian church, you're going to see sometime in the next 3 weeks the Wiccan, a Wiccan priestess is going to be talking or something like that. All right, but the foundations of that is evident in Unitarianism. Unitarianism denies the deity of Christ. Jesus is not God. And then they push God off to being somewhere out. Unitarians are worse than deists, let's just put it that way. A deist says there is a God, he started things up, and he leaves us to our own devices, which is interesting. Some of the most famous deists in American history don't even believe that, like Jefferson and Franklin. But a Unitarian is worse than a deist. Unitarian is going to reject God, and so when you reject Christ, you reject God. Who becomes your Savior? Who becomes the person that answers your questions for you? You do. Self is. And if self decides that the government will help you, then the government will help you. If self decides that something else will help you, okay, you become the determiner. We are living in a very, very moral society, but there's problems. Why are there problems in a moral society? Because there's people there. Right? Okay? So, a Christian sees problems and says what? We need to bring Christ to those people. A Unitarian sees problems, he's not going to think about Christ. Right? The Unitarians of the early 1800s, and this is where we're turning a point, and this is the seed, this is the beginning of all the problems that we see in education today. And I want to make that point clear. We don't need to go back to 1950 to get good education in America. We don't need to go back to 1900 to get good education in America. We don't need to go back to 1850. We need to get all the way back to 1800. If we can and even then, in 1800s, we have Unitarians coming along saying the answer to our problems is education. If we could just teach people what's good, they won't do what's bad. Have we ever heard that before? Okay, so some people said yes. A grin shows up on Rick's face when I start the statement. Okay, where have we heard that before? I mean, it's nothing new, is it? Did it come from Christ? Did it come from the apostles? No, it came from Socrates. Okay, Socrates is a pagan. No, he's as far as a non-Christian, he's a pretty decent guy. He stands up for some things that seem to be right, but he doesn't understand at the root of things why people do things wrong and how to make them do what's right. He doesn't acknowledge Christ. Of course, Christ hasn't even come when he's alive, but he doesn't acknowledge the God of the Bible. And so when you don't acknowledge the God of the Bible, when you don't acknowledge Christ, when you're a Unitarian, it only makes sense that we see these problems, we need to educate people. Okay? If we could just teach them what's right, they won't do what's wrong. And we're still a growing country, and there's people in this country. So you're always going to find problems that need solved. Right? You're always going to find problems that need solved. You're always going to find poor people that can't afford things. Somebody said that before, right? The poor you have with you always. And I know that's correct, because the guy that said it, I shouldn't say the guy. It's Jesus Christ. He said, the poor you have with you always. You're not, and he was just saying that in passing, but even just a passing statement from Christ is true, isn't it? You're always going to have the poor with you. It doesn't mean you shouldn't treat them well. Doesn't mean, but no one is going to eradicate poverty. You can't. You just can't do it. Jesus didn't say there must be, you're going to be poor for the rest of your life, but he didn't say any one person will be poor all their life, but he said you're always going to have poor people. So we're not going to eradicate poverty. Anyway, that's a side note. But it's related to what we're saying. Unitarians are going to say, we can fix society. We can make it into a perfect society. We can have a place where everybody lives in harmony. Let's if there's enough of us that think this way, we can just get away from all these wackos here and go and found our own little town, and we'll call it New Harmony. New Harmony, Indiana, for that matter. Okay? There's a lot of this type of thinking growing up at this time in our history, early 1800s. I'm jumping down a little early, but this is rising out of this Unitarian thought. Unitarians have basically, at this point, taken over Harvard University. Harvard is very influential in Boston. New England still is very influential in the country. Massachusetts becomes very influential in the country through this. So, there is a growing idea that education is going to save mankind. Education is going to take the problems out of our society that we see. And I'm not saying we should just let the problems continue, but hopefully we all recognize that education is not going to take the problems out of our society. Will it help people? Sure, it will help. Okay? But it's not going to eradicate the problems. It's not going to be the salvation of mankind. As Christians, I'm going back and forth here, but I don't think wishy-washy. As Christians, we think, yes, we must educate our children. Education is something that must take place. It is taking place regardless of whether we're involved in it or not, for that matter. But it's not the salvation of mankind. So, jumping over all kinds of different things, I want to give you now a list of states that enacted state laws. State laws that are directly related to education. I don't know so much about this first one except the date. The second one is more influential, and it comes quite a few years after in this time period. So let's just say Maine enacts a state law that is directly connected to the idea of education. I don't have the name of the law. They do it in 1820. In 1820. Either it's not such a bad law, but because it's related, it gets in this list, or there's so few people up in Maine that it's not, if you change a place with a few little people, it's not influencing other people in the whole country. It could be maybe a little of both of that. I don't know the history of this law, the Maine law. The next law is the Massachusetts law that is passed, enacted in 1827. Okay, so this is 7 years later, and this is why I'm saying I don't know much about that law and it's not so influential, because this is the law that becomes very influential in American education. 1827, the Massachusetts legislature creates a state board of education. Okay? A state board of education. 1789, we have Boston in Massachusetts setting up a city system of education, and of course they had some people that made the decisions about it, probably a city board of education or a city superintendent of education, whatever. Okay? But now in Massachusetts, in the whole state, we have a state board of education. Now this comes really as a result of a lot of pressure from Unitarians. Okay? So, and then getting this law in place gives them a platform to go even further with their ideas. This is not the start of some bad thinking about education. The Unitarian thought that public education that education is going to be the answer to our problems is the start of it, I would say. And that thinking pushes, and makes arguments for a board of education, and Massachusetts enacts that, 1827, a state board of education. It also provides that there be a secretary of the board. And the secretary of the State Board of Education would investigate the schools across the state of Massachusetts. His job would be to go and observe schools, look at their facilities, interview their teachers, watch their education, and then report to the legislature through the Board of Education the status, the condition of schools, and then the Board of Education would request more money from the state of Massachusetts to improve those conditions. So he would find people meeting in bad conditions, buildings that weren't up to his standard, find teachers that didn't have the training that he thought they would have. He might find some good things also that he liked. Okay? But he's going to give a report of the condition of schools in Massachusetts to the board. The board is going to request money from the state legislature for more money for schools. This is what, and now we're 188 years later, it's still kind of the same process. With this, hopefully you can see this is the start of this system that we have today. It's not yet as bad as what we have yet today, and not even, there's one missing element to it still, but this is the start of it. The man who is appointed to be the secretary, the first secretary of the Massachusetts State Board of Education, his name is Horace Mann. We'll spend a fair amount of time in our next meeting talking about Horace Mann, but we'll just note now that he's the first secretary, and he uses that position and his experience to write about, to also write about what is taking place and infuse his views about the answers to the problems that he's seeing, and in what's called a Common School Journal. Okay, and that Common School Journal that was started in 1838, this is 10 years later, is published across the state, but also spreads to other states, so that his philosophy, his thinking about education, and his answers to educational problems, and how education is the answer to society's problems, is being spread across the United States through the Common School Journal. Delaware enacts a state law in 1829. And then in 1834, Pennsylvania passes the Pennsylvania Free School Act. The Pennsylvania Free School Act of 1834. Now the free school is the important part of this law. This law enacted that taxes be collected on people's property for the maintenance of schools. So this is where we start having property taxes for schools. And one of the slogans for the passage of this law was taxes for schools. Taxes for schools. Up to this point, schools that were provided for publicly, they had to figure out different ways to do it. Well, now we're coming to a statewide level, and there's a group of people saying we ought to just use taxes to support the schools in the state. Lots and lots of opposition to it. In fact, it almost didn't pass. It was rescued by Thaddeus Stevens, who ends up being a part of Lincoln's administration. That's just kind of an interesting point. But it's rescued by saying, well, it was, now I'm forgetting exact details, but it was passed with the promise that we'll try it for 1 year. But after a year, it was rejected. It had widespread opposition, but then was rescued by Thaddeus Stevens, who was in the legislature, probably Speaker of the Pennsylvania House or something like that. Kind of, you know, get the foot in the door with 1 year, and you're never going to take it away. we have this significant development in educational history of state boards and the influence of the state secretary, particularly Horace Mann, who we'll talk about in our next class period, and the journals of the educational journals that are promoting different people's thoughts. This happens in the early 1800s, and it's the foundation basically of what we have today still. And so we'll pick up there talking about several of the later leaders of this time period. Time period. Time period. Time period. Time period.